The air hung thick with smoke and silence over the makeshift camp nestled deep in the mountains of the Philippine jungle. The bamboo fences rose tall like skeletal fingers, reaching out from the earth and wrapped around the women who paced slowly. Under the pale morning sun, their uniforms, once crisp and neat, now clung to their bodies in sweat-stained folds, the fabric rough and heavy after weeks of rain and rot, their hair unkempt, their eyes sunken with hunger and dread. They had been moved. Here 2 weeks ago, after a march that took 3 days and nearly as many lives, and still none of them knew where exactly they were or what was coming next. Private Nakamura clutched the edge of her canteen, which had been dry for 2 days, and glanced toward the watchtower, where a lone guard stood motionless, his rifle slung lazily across his chest, his eyes hidden behind a cracked pair of glasses. He did not speak. None of them did. The guards moved like shadows between the huts and trees only, pausing to bark orders in rough Tagalog and broken Japanese, but even then they seemed detached, like they too were waiting for something more ominous than this routine of silence and starvation. Sergeant Watanabe, the eldest of the group with streaks of gray cutting through her long braid, crouched near the cooking pit and stirred the ashes that had long gone cold. She had not eaten since the 4th day, and yet she moved with a quiet discipline born from years of service. Her mind sharp even. As her body weakened, she had begun to track the guards' routines, how they rotated when they disappeared into the jungle, what cargo they unloaded at dusk, and more importantly, how the mood had shifted 2 days ago when a higher-ranking officer had arrived by jeep, his boots clean, his coat ironed, and his eyes colder than the steel at his hip. He had said nothing that first day, simply inspected the camp, checked the ledger, and nodded once to the commander before vanishing inside the barracks. The women noticed how the guards stood straighter when he passed, how they saluted without meeting his gaze, how they seemed even more tense afterward. Something had changed, and no one could explain what or why. On the morning of the 4th day, the women were ordered to assemble in the center of the yard, their formation tight, their shoulders drawn back. Despite the pain and fatigue, the commander stepped forward, his uniform immaculate despite the filth of the camp, and he held a paper in his hand, the corners creased and smudged as if it had been passed through many hands. He began to read in halting Japanese, slow and deliberate words that made no sense at first, until the realization crept over them like a sudden fog. They were to strip, remove everything down to the skin, and stand for inspection. No reason was given, no explanation offered, only the command and the expectation of obedience. And with it came a silence so thick it felt as though even the birds had stopped singing. The women glanced at each other, some in disbelief, others in horror, a few in fury. Sergeant Watanabe stepped forward slightly, her eyes narrow as if to challenge the absurdity of it, but one look from the officer silenced her, and she knew without doubt that resistance would bring worse than humiliation. Private Nakamura was the first to comply, slowly peeling off her shirt, her arms trembling as the warm air licked her skin, followed by others' hesitant hands undoing buttons, sliding fabric. Down bodies already bruised by war and shame. Soon the yard was a grave of clothing heaped in piles at their feet. The guards said nothing. They barely moved, watching with expressions carved from stone. It was then that the photographer arrived, a small man wearing civilian clothes and thick glasses with a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He did not greet the guards nor acknowledge the women. He simply adjusted his lens and began to snap photos, methodically moving from one side of the yard to the other as if cataloging evidence for some hidden trial. The flash of the camera felt unnatural, like lightning in the pit of hell, and the women could do nothing but stand exposed in the heat, their humiliation now documented by a stranger whose face revealed no emotion. And yet, this was not the end. Because far above them, through the haze of morning sun, came the distant hum of an aircraft. It grew louder each second, until the trees shuddered and the camp seemed to tilt beneath its roar. The women looked skyward, shielding their eyes, and saw a transport plane dip low over the compound, its wings wide, its body silver and scarred. It circled once, then again, before disappearing behind the ridge, the sound fading as quickly as it had come. The guards exchanged glances. The commander clenched the paper tighter, and the photographer paused as if listening for something more. Something delayed and far more important than a simple flyover. The officer raised one hand and, for the first time, his voice cracked when he spoke, telling the guards to move the women back to their barracks quickly now. No more photos, no more explanations. Just the sudden urgency that spread like fire in dry grass. Sergeant Watanabe felt it. In her bones, a shift in the air, a pressure rising from the soil itself, as if something buried was waking beneath them. She turned toward Private Nakamura, who stared blankly at the pile of uniforms still lying in the yard untouched, as if waiting for someone else to wear them, someone who never would. Then the siren began to scream from the edge of the compound, a sound none of them had heard before. Sharp and mechanical and far too modern for a place built of mud and fear. The photographer vanished into the barracks. The guards shouted over each other as they scrambled toward the tower. And one by one the women were herded back inside their bamboo huts, still half naked, still without answers, still with the weight of a new terror pressing down on their chests. And somewhere in the jungle beyond the ridge, something was coming. Something none of them had been prepared for, and something that would make the act of undressing feel like the smallest of violations. The women stood barefoot, on the dirt, their skin exposed to the brutal morning sun, the memory of the siren still ringing in their ears. The guards shouted orders in bursts of clipped syllables, some of them dragging crates toward the edge of the yard, while others locked. The gates with heavy chains that clanked like iron thunder. No one knew what had triggered the alarm, but the urgency was undeniable, and yet the commander remained perfectly still in the center of the camp. His gloved hand raised the paper, now tucked. Under his arm, his mouth pressed in a line of restrained fury, Private Nakamura watched as two soldiers unrolled a canvas backdrop along the fence. She could not comprehend why such a thing would be necessary here in this prison carved out of jungle and misery. Sergeant Watanabe had narrowed her eyes, already sensing that the order to undress had not been about humiliation alone. The way the guards refused to meet their eyes, the way the photographer had circled like a buzzard snapping images. Without purpose or shame, it all pointed to something bigger than punishment, something that someone outside this camp wanted to see or prove. The canvas was pure white and stretched tight and clean as though it had never touched soil one by one. The women were summoned by number, not by name, their designations called out in a cold, mechanical tone, each stepping forward, hesitating only for a moment before standing before the backdrop, their arms at their sides, their eyes forward as the camera clicked and buzzed and clicked again, capturing images of their skin, of their posture, of the discoloration on their arms and necks, marks that no one had noticed before. Marks that seemed to shimmer faintly under the sun, when Private Sato stepped forward. The commander leaned toward the photographer and muttered something in a low, urgent tone. The photographer adjusted his lens and took more shots this time, closer, more deliberate, capturing every inch of her back where a pattern of bruises had begun to form, a pattern not caused by blunt force, but something else. Something spreading beneath the skin, like a sickness waiting to bloom. The guards began murmuring to one another, not in Japanese, but in English, rough and low and hurried. They were losing control of the moment, trying to maintain the order of a ritual they did not fully understand. Sergeant Watanabe knew then that these photographs were being collected for someone who had never set foot in the camp. Someone who wanted evidence, perhaps, of a weapon or an experiment or a condition that had never been seen before. And she felt her throat tighten with a realization she dared not speak aloud. The women were not prisoners of war. They were test subjects, unwilling participants, in a study conducted under the guise of captivity, and yet even that did not explain the canvas. The photographer, the sudden urgency that now ran through the guards like a storm. Just then the jungle seemed to shudder, a low mechanical whine pulsing. Through the trees, like the heartbeat of something unnatural, the same transport plane that had circled the camp earlier returned its shadow, sweeping over the yard as it descended lower than before. The women lifted their heads, shielding their eyes. Against the glare, its wings slicing the sky with a sound that was too controlled, too deliberate. It made a slow pass over the camp again, then banked sharply, disappearing behind the ridge a second time, but this time it did not vanish without consequence. Ground rumbled softly, and then all fell silent. The birds had gone, the insects quiet. The air thickened as if holding its breath. The commander stepped forward and addressed the women, his voice hoarse from heat and command. "You will remain still." He said, "You will not speak. You will not move until ordered." And then he turned toward the guards, barking. New instructions that sent them scattering toward the barracks and towers and even into the jungle. Some of them carrying crates, others shouldering tools or devices. The women had never seen before, rods with long antennas, black cases that clicked and hissed as they were opened. Private Nakamura shivered, though the heat had not lessened. Her skin tingling with a strange itch just beneath the surface, as though something within her blood was awakening. She looked down at her arms and saw faint discoloration patches the same hue as Sergeant Watanabe's, back beginning to spread near her elbows. She blinked and rubbed at them, but the marks remained unchanged, growing darker, more distinct by the minute. They were not bruises, not rashes, but something altogether different, something that reacted to heat or light, or perhaps exposure. The photographer continued his work, now flanked by two guards, one of them holding a notebook, scribbling furiously with every click of the camera. The other, watching the women with eyes that darted constantly from face to face as if searching for the first sign of collapse or defiance or worse. None of the women dared speak, but the unease between them crackled like dry leaves waiting to ignite. They were being documented, every inch, every freckle, every change recorded, catalogued for a purpose, still hidden just beyond the edges of comprehension. Then came the most jarring moment of all, a sudden flash of light. Not from the camera, but from the tree line, a beam that swept across the yard like a searchlight, bright and cold and silent. It touched each woman for barely a second, and when it was gone, they stood in shock. The light had passed through them as though their bodies were glass leaving. Behind an echo that resonated in their bones, the commander shouted something unintelligible, his face twisted in alarm, and the guards ran, now truly ran back into the camp, dropping their equipment as they went. The sky darkened without warning, not with clouds, but with a haze that rolled in low and fast from the east, thick and gray, with a strange shimmer as though the air itself had been altered. The guards slammed the barrack doors shut from the outside, locking the women inside their huts. Still undressed, still unsure what had just occurred, still shaking with the sense that something had been activated inside them or around them or both. Sergeant Watanabe pressed her hands to the bamboo wall and whispered to no one. "They are not testing us. They are waiting." Outside the camp, the jungle had gone silent again, but now it was the silence of something watching. Not animal, not human, but mechanical and vast, like a machine buried deep beneath the soil that had finally awakened. High above, beyond the ridge, the plane circled back again, slower this time as though preparing for something final. The sky grew quieter, but not calmer as the transport aircraft vanished once again, behind the distant mountain ridge. The jungle lay, heavy with silence as though nature itself had recoiled in fear, and the women still locked in their huts, still stripped of dignity and still uncertain of what they had witnessed, clung to each other in the dim light that filtered through the cracks. In the bamboo walls, Private Nakamura pressed her ear to the slats, her breath shallow, her heart hammering a rhythm that echoed the tension around her. She could no longer tell whether the tremble in her legs came from fear, hunger, or something deeper. More insidious, something growing inside her. Sergeant Watanabe sat against the far wall. Her eyes closed, but her fingers twitching against the dirt floor. She had been counting in silence the seconds since the flash, the minutes since the siren, the hours since the order to undress, and through it all, she had been building a pattern in her mind, trying to connect the pieces that no longer fit together. The plane, the photographs, the strange beams of light, the sudden appearance of foreign equipment. Nothing resembled warfare as she knew it, and yet everything about it carried the weight of strategy, of experimentation, of cold, precise calculation. Outside, the guards moved in nervous bursts, their voices sharper than before, and the sound of crates being opened and slammed shut carried through the compound like thunder in a glass bottle. One of them shouted something in English, and another responded in a different dialect that none of the women recognized, and that only deepened the dread. Spreading through the barracks, the soldiers who had once barked with authority now stumbled through orders with the urgency of men out of time. Then the sound of the gate opening sent another wave of stillness through the camp. Not the main gate, but the smaller one near the rear. The one no prisoner had ever been allowed to approach. The women heard the creak of its hinges, followed by the steady march of boots approaching. Not the heavy stomp of jungle soldiers, but the crisp, calculated stride of outsiders, their pace unhurried, their arrival rehearsed. Private Nakamura strained to see through a gap in the wall, and what she glimpsed stole the breath from her chest. A group of men in unfamiliar uniforms entered the camp. Not Japanese, not Filipino, and not American either. Their coats were long and dark, and their faces impassive, their eyes shielded by thin glasses that reflected the gray jungle light behind them. Followed a woman tall and pale, her hair tucked beneath a cap that bore no insignia. She carried a metal case in each hand and walked with the confidence of someone who feared nothing and knew everything. Her presence changed the air in the camp like a sudden shift in weather, both unnatural and irreversible. Group made no announcement, did not address the prisoners or the guards. Instead, they moved directly to the commander, who saluted, but received no reply. Only a nod from the woman, who handed him a folder, thick with documents and maps and photographs, and what looked like blood test results and radiation charts. Sergeant Watanabe opened her eyes as if sensing the shift, and stood slowly walking to the door of the hut, pressing her weight against it, listening to the rustle of pages and the low hum of voices, negotiating something too dangerous to be spoken aloud. And then the woman in the coat spoke, her voice clear and clinical, every word measured and sharp. She told the commander to bring the prisoners out one at a time, only those from the central barrack, only those whose photos matched the profiles, and the guards moved immediately, unlocking the door of the hut and shouting names that had never belonged to the women, but instead were codes, combinations of letters and numbers that made no sense to those who had carried them, and yet each prisoner responded instinctively as if those designations had always been part of them without their knowing. Private Nakamura was the second to be called, and as she stepped into the yard, the foreign soldiers took her by the arm, not roughly, but with a firmness that allowed no resistance. They guided her to a small tent that had not been there the day before, and inside she found a sterile space filled with machines whose purpose she could not guess. Wires and screens and strange blinking lights and a low mechanical hum that seemed to sync with the rhythm of her own heartbeat. They sat her down in a metal chair and strapped her arms to the sides, gently, methodically, efficiently. A woman in the coat leaned over her and said in perfect Japanese, "You were exposed before you arrived at this camp. You were selected based on your proximity to an event that does not officially exist. What we are about to do is not for punishment. It is for data. You may feel pain, but it is necessary." And before Nakamura could ask what any of it meant, a needle pierced her arm, and the machines came alive, their lights flickering like stars trapped in glass, and she felt a warmth spread through her veins, a warmth that did not belong in any human body. Back in the main yard, Sergeant Watanabe was the next to be taken. She did not resist, and she did not speak. She walked with her head held high, past the guards, past the commander, past the pile of discarded uniforms that still lay untouched where the women had been stripped. And as she stepped through the entrance to the tent, she caught a glimpse of a screen showing a diagram of the human body overlaid with heat signatures and pulses, of energy clustered near the bones, near the spine, near the skull, not wounds, not illness. Something else, something awakened. And then the plane returned once more, lower than ever, its engines screaming as it passed above the camp. This time it did, not circle. This time it opened, and from its belly fell 3 long black canisters that landed in the clearing beyond the fence with a dull, hollow thud. The sound of finality, the sound of a sealed decision. The guards froze the foreign officers, did not blink, and the woman in the coat closed her notebook and said, the phrase that turned the jungle colder than death. Phase 2 begins at nightfall. Inside the huts, the remaining women clutched each other, trying not to imagine what Phase 2 meant, trying not to hear the machines whirring inside the tent, trying not to believe what they already knew, that this was not a prison, not a camp, not a mistake, but a carefully orchestrated trap built not to hold them, but to study them, to transform them, and perhaps to erase them when the data was complete. And in the sky above the mountain ridge, the plane vanished for the last time, swallowed by clouds that did not belong to any weather pattern recorded in any war log known to man-darkness. Fell quickly over the camp as if the jungle itself had conspired to smother the last traces of sunlight. The canisters that had fallen from the transport plane remained untouched just beyond the fence, casting long black shadows across the dirt. Clearing as the guards avoided looking at them, speaking less now, moving with the wary steps of men who knew they were no longer in control in the center of the compound. The foreign officers had set up a mobile command tent, and within its canvas walls light glowed faint and blue like something alive and thinking. Sergeant Watanabe was brought back from the tent, her face pale, her arms trembling but her eyes sharper. Than ever she said nothing as she was led to the barrack where the other women waited, each of them watching her, silently afraid to speak. Afraid of what she had seen or what had been done to her. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts, and for a moment she collapsed against the wall. But when Private Nakamura reached for her, the sergeant shook her head once and whispered, "Not pain, not injury. Listen to me. They are not here for us. They are here for what they think we are." The others stared, in confusion, trying to understand her words, trying to make sense of what had started as imprisonment and become something so much stranger. Nakamura sat beside her and asked what happened in the tent, and the sergeant replied only with a name. One. She had not spoken in months, a name from before the transfer, before the jungle, before the orders and the silence and the disappearances. She said Nagashima, and Nakamura froze, her mind racing to remember why that name mattered, why it felt burned into her without memory. Nagashima had been a village, a small place tucked along the northeastern coast of Japan, far from the front lines, far from the bombs and blood, and yet it had vanished 6 weeks ago, without warning, without cause, and without witness an entire population. Gone in a single day, only whispers remained, and rumors of a flash in the sky, and the sound of thunder. Without clouds, Watanabe had been stationed nearby at the time, and she had been there during the evacuation. Rushed and chaotic, filled with orders that made no sense to the soldiers who gave them or the civilians forced to obey. She had seen the child before she left, a little girl standing in the middle of the road, holding a pendant shaped like a lotus, the petals etched in fine detail with a symbol on the back that did not belong to any known religion or culture. It had been pressed into Watanabe's hand as the trucks rolled out and the sky turned silver, and now, months later, in this forgotten camp, in this jungle hell, that same pendant had been pulled from her bootlaces and triggered something she could not explain. When the foreign woman saw it, her demeanor had changed. The calm mask had cracked, and for the first time, fear crept into her voice. She had ordered the testing to stop. She had asked who else had seen the child, who else had come from that zone, and when no answers came, she had whispered a word in English exposure and stepped back, as if the sergeant were burning from within. Nakamura stared at the sergeant as the pieces came together like broken glass, glinting in the dark. The women had been selected not for what they had done, not for intelligence or tactics or proximity to battle, but because they had passed through places marked by something unnatural, something no one was supposed to survive, let alone walk away from, and they had been walking ever since, carrying it without knowing, without warning. And now the ones who had found them were unsure whether to study them or to contain them forever. Outside the tent, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees with a sound that was not quite natural, like the jungle was shifting, breathing, adjusting to what had been awakened. One of the canisters near the fence began to hiss a soft, steady release of gas that shimmered in the moonlight. The guards panicked, shouting in multiple languages, grabbing rifles that would do nothing against whatever had been sealed inside. But the foreign officers remained still, one of them holding a device that blinked rapidly as the mist spread low and wide. The gas did not rise, it crawled along the ground like an animal seeking something, and when it reached the edge of the barracks, it stopped as if waiting. Sergeant Watanabe stood slowly, her body stiff and aching, and walked to the door, ignoring the protests of the other women. She opened it just a crack and watched as the mist began to coil around itself, forming shapes not solid, but not smoke either, like silhouettes caught between existence and memory. They began to move not toward the guards, not toward the tents, but toward the photographs pinned to the canvas walls, each step guided by images of the women whose bodies had been mapped and scanned and catalogued. One of the shapes touched a photograph and the paper blackened, curled and disintegrated. Another approached the tent and passed through it without sound, without force, and the lights inside flickered and went dark. The foreign woman inside began to scream, not from pain, but from revelation, from knowing something that could not be unknown. Sergeant Watanabe closed the door quietly and whispered to Nakamura, "We are not infected. We are remembered." The mist began to recede, pulled by invisible threads back toward the canisters, which now lay empty, their contents returned or perhaps reclaimed. The jungle fell silent again, and in that silence, the guards began to retreat, abandoning weapons and orders, running toward the edge of the compound where the forest grew thick and unwelcoming. None of the foreign officers followed them. They remained still, watching as the last tendrils of mist vanished into the soil, leaving only photographs with missing faces and a notebook filled with data that no longer mattered. Nakamura turned to Watanabe and asked, "What now? What do we do now?" And the sergeant said nothing for a long time before answering quietly, "They thought they were studying us, but they never realized what we were carrying was not a disease. It was a memory. Not ours, but someone else's, someone old and forgotten, and now awakened by light and fear and science and greed. And the more they look, the more they will find, and the more they find, the more they will lose." The pendant still hung from Watanabe's neck, its lotus shape glowing faintly in the dark, as the sky above the camp split with lightning that made no sound and cast no rain, and the jungle watched without blinking as the camp began to fall. Apart from the inside out, by morning the camp no longer resembled the place it had been only one day before the perimeter fences lay partially collapsed. The towers abandoned, the guards nowhere in sight. Even the strange foreign officers had vanished, leaving behind their tents, their machines, and the blackened photographs now scattered across the dirt like leaves after a fire. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through bamboo and the quiet breathing of the remaining women still waiting for a reason to move or speak or believe that any of it had truly happened. Sergeant Watanabe stood near the old cooking pit where smoke no longer rose from the ashes, where memory no longer clung to routine. She held the pendant between her fingers, watching how it caught the new light, how its surface pulsed softly, as if responding to something no one could see. Private Nakamura sat nearby, her knees drawn to her chest, staring at the white canvas backdrop that still fluttered in the breeze. Untouched now by camera or command, it no longer looked like a tool of science, but a shroud left behind by something that had finished its purpose. No one spoke of the mist or the shapes or the canisters that now lay empty and inert outside the fence. The earth beneath them cracked slightly, as if scorched from the inside, as if whatever had been held within those vessels had returned to a place far deeper than the surface, far older than the war, than the soldiers, than the forgotten governments, who had sent these women here without explanation or protection. Watanabe finally turned to the others and said it was not a weapon. It was a message, or maybe a memory, or maybe both, but it was never ours, and it was never meant to be understood by people who would only measure it with fear. She looked toward the jungle, and for the first time she did not feel trapped by it. Instead, she felt as though it had been watching them all this time, not with malice, but with patience, waiting for something to be returned or remembered. In the days that followed, no one came for them. No more planes, no more trucks, no more foreign voices. The women began to rebuild what little they could, using the tools left behind, converting the barracks into shelters, gathering food from the forest, planting what little seed stock they found in the abandoned supplies. The notebook with diagrams and notes was buried in the roots of the tallest tree at the edge of the camp, not to hide it, but to give it back to the earth from which the truth had been stolen. And then, one night, as the moon hung low and red over the treetops, the ground trembled once more, not violently, but gently, as if something enormous had shifted far below and in the silence that followed. Watanabe rose from her mat and stepped into the clearing alone, the pendant glowing brightly now, pulsing like a heartbeat that did not match her own. She did not speak. She did not look back, and the others did not try to stop her. They simply watched. As she walked beyond the gate, past the fence, past the edge of the clearing, and into the trees which parted for her, as though they too recognized the weight she carried. She never returned, but neither did the fear in her absence. The women were not lost, they were not abandoned. They were simply changed by something larger than war. Something older than nations, something that could not be categorized in files or captured on film, and in time, they would each find their own path through the jungle, their own truth, their own silence. Years later, long after the war had ended, after the borders had shifted, and the world had forgotten the names of camps that never officially existed, a photograph was found in the ruins of a shuttered research facility. It showed a group of women barefoot standing before a white canvas, their eyes steady, their expressions unreadable, but behind them barely visible through the fading image.